Hello Year 11. This is the first of a number of short videos revising Blood Brothers, which is the more modern play that you have studied for literature and is going to be one of those that's in your mock exam in November as well. So Blood Brothers, this particular sequence is going to be about the basic plot and characters of the play. If you feel that you already have a good memory of the play, what happens to who the main characters are, then you probably need to ignore this one and go to the second of these recordings. If, however, you can't really remember very much about it at all, then I suggest you pause the playback and find yourself some pens, nice different colour pens, always a good idea, here we are, and a piece of paper, and take yourself through what I'm going to be doing with you now. Alright, Blood Brothers. Our two main characters in this are the two women. Mrs. Johnson is the one that we see more of, and Mrs. Lyons is the other mother, in inverted commas. Mrs. Johnson is a working class mother, and although we do not get marked on context, we need to be aware of the differences and what affects the characters that we have. Mrs. Johnson is middle class and therefore means that she is better off and has more money and a better prospect in life. What else do we know about Mrs. Johnson? Mrs. Johnson she's got lots of kids. She's had more than 7 children, and because her husband left her, she is very much having to look after all of these children herself. Whereas Mrs. Lyons is childless and she's married to Mr. Lyons. And Mr. Lyons is the character we see bits of, and he is important, but he is not seen as much as the women are. Okay. So what is it that we need to be thinking about with the opening parts of this? It's this situation. Her husband has left her, so therefore Mrs. Johnson is really very reliant on having her job. So her cleaning job is very important to her. That's her only source of income. And although there might have been benefits at the time, they weren't as good or as helpful as perhaps benefits are now. So the job was very important to her. Because Mrs. Lyons is a middle class family, she doesn't have to do all of that hard work herself, so she luckily has a cleaner. And that cleaner is Mrs. Johnson. When Mrs. Johnson realises she is pregnant again with twins, she worries how she is going to cope looking after the children as they are. Mrs. Lyons is desperate to have a child, and in that desperation she manipulates Mrs. Johnson to sell her one of her children. So she suggests to Mrs. Johnson that she will take one of the twins. That she will give him a good home. That she will love and look after him. And therefore, of course, it will also make life much easier for Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson too is desperate. She's already got people after her because she hasn't paid her bills. And she needs to get back to work. With twins, that's really difficult. So in fact, for her, giving up her child is part of her survival. And also, she knows that they will have a better home. This other child will have a better home in this middle class family than the two of them will have with her. She can look after one, she can manage another one, but another two is just that a little bit too much. So she hands over Edward in order to give him a better life. Now it might be that we would criticise her for that, but the play makes it clear that she's doing it for the best of reasons. So we shouldn't be too harsh on her. So at this stage it looks as if both women now have what they're happy with. Mrs. Lyons is delighted that she's got a child. Just so happens her husband is away on business for a convenient number of months, and therefore she has the child by the time he gets home, and he thinks it is his. So Mr. Lyons is believing Edward is his child. Mrs. Lyons then gets rather jealous about Mrs. Johnson, and because of that she sacks Mrs. Johnson from her cleaning job, because she thinks that she is spending too much time looking at Edward. So because she feels vulnerable, Mrs. Johnson tries to make herself more secure by getting rid of Mrs. Johnson. And by sacking her, Mrs. Johnson now has greater difficulty. So it puts Mrs. Johnson in a more difficult position. We see, however, that her love for her family is really strong. And we see that Mrs. Lyons and Edward have a good relationship, but it's not quite right. Can't quite get that in there. Okay, so at that time things seem to settle down. And then Mickey and Edward meet again at 7 years old. And that meeting establishes a very strong friendship. And through that friendship, they become blood brothers. Hence the title of the play. Oh, there we go. Of course, this is ironic. They are brothers. Of course, by becoming blood brothers, they're basically saying to each other that you are very important to me. You are as important to me as I am to myself. Okay, so they become these childhood playmates and friends. We're introduced at this point to a few others, like Linda, who is a very good friend to all of them. And we also see Sammy, one of the other children of Mrs. Johnson. Sammy is not very nice. And of course, Edward has no other family, so he kind of relies more on the friendship with Mickey than he might otherwise have done. Now, Linda becomes kind of a best friend to both of them, but she is very much a supporter of Mickey, supports and loves Mickey. Sammy is not a very nice character. He bullies Mickey as a child. He introduces violence in the games. He has first of all a toy, then a real gun. And of course in Act 2 he unfortunately encourages him into bad ways. Meanwhile, on the Lyons side, Mrs. Lyons only then gradually realises who Edward is playing with, and she's not happy. And so she tries to stop that. And it shows that actually it's not really possible to keep them apart. They've got so much in common that they want to be together, and they don't really like being barred from each other. Edward at this time shows something of his real nature. He starts getting into trouble. And by copying Mickey, he becomes more and more like him. And that includes swearing at his mother as well. Okay, so in order to keep her child, Edward, away from this nasty Mickey, Mrs. Lyons goes slightly obsessive. So she gets very obsessive about Edward. And this results in they move away. Mrs. Lyons thinks that's the best thing that can happen, and everything is much better for her. She feels relief at that. The family over here, the Johnson family, they carry on much as they were, and all part of this regeneration program. This is all based in Liverpool, and that place with the awful football team. And it was part of in the 1960s. There was a big housing regeneration program, and new parts were built outside of Liverpool. Skelmersdale, I think the place is called. And that's where these go. They move away. It's part of that relocation. Unfortunately, at the end of Act 1, Mrs. Johnson, who is in a council house, provided housing rather than something that they bought themselves, Mrs. Johnson in that situation is also relocated, and ironically to the same place as Mrs. Lyons. And that's where Act 1 ends. They think they're safe, or Mrs. Lyons thinks they're safe. Mrs. Johnson is very happy that they are going to have a better life, because they are now going to be moving into a new life, away from the old Liverpool. Okay, in our next session I will look at Act 2. Okay, thank you.